How much time do we have left? Because 10 minutes or 15? If you only have 10 minutes, then I will skip my presentation. We can just talk.
We have more than that. We can go a bit over, but
okay, I'll do it shortly then.
A short one.
Okay, thank you very much. I will not talk about Nordic conservatism in the sense that I will talk about specific thinkers or the history of thinking. I would instead point to some specific traits of the Nordic countries that I consider conservative, some contemporary traits that I consider conservative, and where I think that conservatives really should act. And that is the issue of social cohesion. Because a lot of well-documented knowledge exists about the Nordic nations, we know that there is a widespread solidarity and positive national emotions are strong. We know that the nations are culturally homogeneous and that there are very high levels of trust, prosperity, and civic liberty, and that the states are characterized by a low level of corruption. So in sociology, the attempt to achieve such a high level of cohesion is sometimes expressed as the problem of getting to Denmark. That's at least how Francis Fukuyama phrases it. However, cohesion cannot be and has not been the result of mere political and legal institution building. It's also a matter of culture. In other words, there are specific cultural prerequisites for social cohesion, and these can be found in nations such as the Nordic nations. So the informal cultural norms that promote cohesion include virtues such as honesty, reliability, and in general reciprocity, that is the willingness to help each other. In short, social cohesion is constantly created spontaneously when people live their ordinary lives in civil society. Civil society is the key word here. This kind of trust cuts across social divisions, and historically it's due to the many civil movements which have existed in the Nordic nations since the 19th century. These movements have helped to create a cooperative social capital. In particular, the cooperative movements and sports movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, where people came together in, so to speak, bottom-up and voluntarily organized work around enterprise and building of sports centers. These movements have played a major role in terms of creating social cohesion. At least in Denmark, this civic engagement has also been expressed in a well-organized community building upon peasant and worker movements, as well as the free church and free school movements. So society is, and this is the conservative idea, society is in danger of being undermined and atomized if it lacks what sociologists term mediating structures in civil society. Mediating structures such as cooperative movements, but also, of course, strong neighborhoods, families, voluntary associations, and churches. So it's clear that social cohesion relies on belonging to a common culture, whereas multiculturalism tends to weaken cohesion. Cohesion seems to thrive best in places of cultural homogeneity and national solidarity, such as in the Nordic nations. In short, one could argue that in a free civil society there must be internal moral bonds between citizens, for only then can they accept that there are limits to their freedom, that the right of one person is the duty of another. So lastly, the crucial aspect of the historic breakthrough of Protestantism in the West was that virtues such as honesty and reciprocity were widely practiced outside the narrow group such as the family. So, shortly to summarize, communities with a common core culture and a common moral language of good and evil are simply more integrated in the sense that they have stronger social cohesion than culturally diverse societies. Thank you. I don't think that very many people actually read probably the two most important conservative philosophers, namely Edmund Burke and Alexis de Tocqueville. At least I haven't stumbled across people who read them, at least before 1980, 70 or so. But the core ideas of these two conservative thinkers have been expressed in society, and I'm thinking, of course, the concept of the small platoons. Nordic countries are rich in small platoons, and that's what I call social cohesion or intermediate structures in civil society. And I was also thinking, Hannes, when you talked about Snorri Sturluson, that this high level of trust we have in Nordic countries is a generalized trust. It's trust among strangers, and it's trust to institutions. And I think that might go several years back, because you talked about this idea that even the king was subject to the same law. So that might be a kind of trust-building experience that has sustained throughout generations. Now, there is one important thing that we haven't touched upon, and that is we have very large welfare states in the Nordic countries. And I think that's a huge problem for conservative thinking, because what the welfare states does is to destroy social capital in civil society. And most notably, this has been seen in regards to the family. Now, we pay so much in tax that people can't afford to stay at home and rear their children at home, so we send them to kindergarten and all kinds of institutions. When you get divorced, you get a lot of money from the state, so it can actually, economically, it's a good idea to get divorced. It doesn't sustain the family. And even in Denmark, I don't know how it is in Sweden and the other countries. In Denmark, the state pays for what we call solo mothers, so they can be pregnant and so start a family without fathers. I think that's really destructive for the kind of conservative intermediate structures in civil society, especially the family. If I just a short comment, I think there is a huge difference between liberalism and conservatism. And one of the books that I've enjoyed the most in the recent years is the American philosopher Patrick Dane's book, Why Liberalism Failed, in which he argues that paradoxically, the welfare state or the state has grown alongside with an emancipation project. Because when you set liberals free, you have to have a larger state in order to realize all these rights that the individual has, and that's the story of Dane's book. I think is very convincing. So liberalism and socialism, in a strange way, are bedfellows in this sense. Because of course the reason, of course, is that individuals who live in civil society, have been placed limits on their actions, and most people, not most people, a lot of people want to liberate themselves from these moral norms that places limits on them, and therefore you have the state that intervenes directly in civil society. So if you haven't read this book, I will surely recommend it. Well, Scruton asks us to preserve the things we love, and one of those things are national cultures. There are many crazy movements in our time, and also in the Nordic countries, who wishes to aggressively abandon nationality. I think Sweden is even officially a multicultural country. So we must roll back these movements and tendencies and conserve nations, because nations are the things that bind us together and creates cultures of trust. Okay, thank you. I will talk a bit about why nation states created peace and stability in post-war Europe. And in fact, this is a subject that I've written a book about, because in 2012, the European Union received the Nobel Peace Prize, actually here in Oslo, the argument was, of course, that it was the European Union who has created peace and stability. And I don't think that's the correct story, at least it's not the whole story. On the contrary, it's the establishment of culturally homogeneous nation states. And so I will focus on the history leading up to establishing these kind of nation states, and I will of course draw heavily on Roger Scruton's arguments, but also arguments from American historians such as Jerry Muller and Samuel Huntington. More specifically, I will make the case for the culturally homogeneous nation state, that is, a nation whose majority shares the same culture. The reason is that this kind of state creates peace and stability within because it draws on social cohesion, and it also creates stability on a larger scale among nations because it solves border conflicts. So peace within and peace without. Most liberals, though, are at unease with nationalism, of course, both intellectually and morally. They go to great lengths to demonstrate that nationalism is deliberately constructed and therefore ought to be deconstructed. And liberal moralists scorn value systems based on narrow group identities rather than universalism. Recently, though, Francis Fukuyama has admitted that the existence of a national identity is needed for liberal democracy to flourish. So they are on their way slowly on the right path. But I don't think that Fukuyama has fully acknowledged the need for cultural homogeneity. And neither has other liberals. The typical liberal story goes that Europeans have concluded that nationalism was a danger and therefore gradually abandoned it. In the post-war decades, Europeans integrated their states into a web of transnational institutions, culminating, of course, in the European Union. So Europeans entered into a post-national era, or so we are told, which was not only a good thing in itself, but also a model for other regions. That might be the end of history thesis delivered earlier. Nationalism, on this liberal view, had been a tragic detour on the road to peaceful liberal democratic order. Now, this is a wrong story in my opinion, but it must be admitted though that the creation of a peaceful order of nation states has often been the product of a violent process of ethnic separation. In areas where that separation has not yet fully occurred, politics is still conflict-driven. Whereas in the year 1900, there were many states in Europe without a single overwhelmingly dominant nationality. Remember, large parts of Europe were dominated by empires. By 2022, there are only a few. Belgium and Switzerland could be mentioned. But Belgium has been close to breaking up. And in Switzerland, the balance of power between the Swiss nations is protected by strict citizenship laws. So, to cut a long story short, in Europe, the separatist project has not so much vanished as triumphed. European stability in the post-war period has in fact been due to the widespread fulfillment of the nationalist project. Right? So it has not vanished, it has fulfilled. Now, there are two major ways of thinking about national identity. One is that all people who live within a country's borders are part of the nation, regardless of their ethnic, racial, or cultural and religious origins. This is what you might term liberal nationalism. However, the concept of national identity that I will defend defines a nation by a shared heritage, which includes a common language and a sense of belonging to a common territory, a place that one can call our homeland. So language and territory are the two most important features. but also such things as common faith, traditions, ancestry, and history is important. In short, what we call a common culture. So nationalism is, of course, all about belonging, to use Roger Scruton's phrase. Politically speaking, this implies that each nation ought to have its own state, and that each state should be made up of the members of a single nation. Nationalism has, in my view, been the strongest political force in modern history, and it still is. Just look at the Ukrainians. So a process of ethnic unmixing took place in the first part of the 20th century and in the years immediately following the end of World War II. As a result, the nationalist ideal was largely realized. For the most part, each nation in Europe had its own state, and each state was made up almost exclusively of a single ethnic nationality with a common culture. Some of the exceptions to this rule included Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. But the subsequent fate of these countries only demonstrated the vitality of nationalism. So, nationalism has frequently led to tension, no need to hide this fact, but, and this is my point, nationalism has also proved to be a source of cohesion and stability. To use Jerry Muller's argument, liberal democracy and ethnic and cultural homogeneity are not only compatible, they can be complementary. The main reason Europe has been so harmonious since World War II is not due to the failure of nationalism, but to its success. Nationalism removed some of the greatest sources of conflict, both within and between countries. The fact that national and state boundaries now largely coincide has meant that there are fewer disputes over borders or secession movements. So, to conclude, these culturally homogeneous polities have displayed a great deal of internal solidarity, a high level of mutual trust, and facilitated the establishment of welfare states. However, in recent decades, we have seen some transformations of the homogeneous nation-states of Europe. These transformations have come from the immigration of people from Asian, African, and Middle Eastern origin, especially Muslim countries. A number of factors, from official multiculturalism to generous welfare states to the ease of contact with ethnic homelands, have made it possible to create parallel societies where assimilation into the larger culture is limited. This is a crucial issue, and it will not just go away, but neither will nationalism. Thank you. Well, finally, Europeans got rid of empires through a long and very violent process, and now people are trying to establish an empire again. I mean, that's plain stupid, because to try to get rid of nationalism is, well, it's not recommendable, because it will pop up again and return with vengeance. So, so we really should be take note of the violent European history and consolidate nation states. But I think that there are two other problems besides this problem with democratic legitimacy. Of course, Roger Scruton has written about this, and transnational jurisdiction always leads to a decline in accountability. But the other problem is that what's the idea behind the EU's integrating force? It can't be that Europeans are united through a common culture, because they don't have the common culture, don't have the same territory and the same language, two most important elements. So it must be the idea that they are united through a constitutional patriotism. That is, a common adherence to the abstract principles in the Constitution. But that has never united anybody. That's one problem. The other problem is the EU doesn't have any identity. And you cannot You cannot feel connected or attached to things that does not have identity. I mean, EU is built up again around these abstract principles, and that's also why they tried to, at least for some years, to make Turkey a member of EU. Why? Because EU doesn't have any identity. The EU don't recognize that thin common European identity we do have, though. Christianity, and so forth. But Christianity they couldn't be written into the Constitution, for instance. So it's a purely abstract project, and nobody can feel committed to an abstract project. We need culture, common culture. And of course, you can read all about this in Scruton's texts. Well, there's nothing as useful for unity as a common enemy, of course. And the reason is that identity depends on difference. I mean, I am somebody because I am not the other person. And that goes for nations as well. But the question is, what will happen the day that the Russians are no longer there, if it happens? Will Ukraine then emerge as a homogeneous nation state? Maybe, maybe not, because I mean, Samuel Huntington wrote terrifically good on this subject in A Clash of Civilizations, where he actually predicted more or less what happens today, because what he said was, Ukraine is a torn country. And so Ukrainians have to deal with this messy problem. And in East European countries and other places, the track record is quite bad. But who knows? I'd hope for the best.